Remarkable Republican here to bring you the truth with truth-flavored bias. Today we're going to do a more light-hearted topic. We're going to talk about the top 10 games of all time on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's do this! I've been a Nintendo guy since my earliest days, and I can attest to the fact that Nintendo has won literally every single console generation from the NES to the Switch. And I think that the one generation that I often overlook is the SNES era, because I actually didn't play much Super Nintendo. Played a lot of NES, and then I played a lot of N64, but for the most part I neglected the Super Nintendo because the few games that I did play for it were a bit disappointing, and I actually found that the controls and many of the titles available were inferior to the NES. Well, that's because I didn't quite know about some of the really good games on the system. I only knew about the first-party Nintendo games, but actually the really good games on this system are sometimes hidden gems. And in recent years I've found some of those, so today we're going to talk about the 10 best games on the SNES. Before some of you tried to argue with me, realize that I have played every single game on the console, and I've been doing research on this topic for the last month, so if you want to debate, it will be a debate that you will lose, and lose horribly. Making a top 10 list is an excellent intellectual exercise because it forces you to make moral choices, and hard moral choices. So the two games that didn't quite make it but will now receive an honorable mention are The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening and Super Double Dragon. So now, without any further ado, let's move on to item number 10 on my list. First up is the first ever first-person shooter, Doom, which was ported to the Super Nintendo. It was originally a PC game, and then it came to the home consoles. Pretty much all the home consoles got a version, but very few of them were as good as the SNES version. Now, unlike the Sega Genesis version, this one has great music, and it also controls really well. The D-pad for this is very accurate, and you also notice that there are all the levels present, which was rare. Even when you got to later consoles like the PlayStation, it really struggled to run Doom properly. But SNES did a great job with it. So without any further ado, here's some footage of vintage SNES Doom, the 10th greatest of all SNES games. During the 1990s, fighting games really reached their peak, and none of them were better than Killer Instinct. It combines the bloodlust of Mortal Kombat with the technique of Street Fighter and the smoothness of later games like Tekken. And there was no better version than the SNES port of the arcade original. Not even the N64 version was this good. So without any further ado, here is some footage of Killer Instinct, the 9th best game in SNES history. Coming in at number 8 is the greatest of all SNES beat-em-ups. Now, the SNES was generally not as strong as the original NES when it came to beat-em-ups, but one of its standout titles was Golden Axe 2. And if you really want to do yourself a favor, then after you watch this video, I recommend that you go look up the introduction for this game. That intro and intro music are absolutely epic, and it really shows off the power of the SNES sound card, which is a thing of legend, and it's very rarely displayed as well as it is in that song. So without further ado, here's footage from Golden Axe 2, the 8th best game in the SNES library. So Golden Axe 2 was the best of the old school style beat 'em ups, and then a new school style began under Batman Forever, which is the first 2.5D beat 'em up. This is something that uses the pre-rendered graphics of Mortal Kombat and combines that with really smooth fighting game controls, but in a beat 'em up with exploration, and you can even go for multiple levels. You have a little bit of platforming. This is a really deep and involved game. And it also gives you the option of playing as Robin. And in fact, Robin is every bit as good, if not better, than Batman in this game, which is incredible because Robin usually gets shortchanged, but in this game he's actually useful, and you can beat the game with him. And also, a lot of people are big fans of the Batman Arkham series. That game is not possible without this game. This game really set the tone and really was more or less the blueprint for the Arkham series. I don't think it would even be possible to talk about Arkham without this game. So without any further ado, here is Batman Forever for the SNES, the 7th greatest of all SNES games. And despite the relatively low number of beat-em-ups on the SNES, there's actually one that is better than Batman Forever and has more platforming, and that is Maximum Carnage on the SNES. This was an amazing game which really brought to life the Marvel Comics, which producers didn't have the balls to bring to television. This game looks amazing. The sequel got botched because they had to play within the technical limitations of the inferior Sega Genesis, but the original Maximum Carnage is a badass fucking game. So here is some footage from Maximum Carnage. There is no other game which enables you to kick this much ass on the SNES. And the number 5 spot is none other than Donkey Kong Country 2. Now, while the best Donkey Kong game is Donkey Kong 64, Donkey Kong Country 2 is also an extremely good platformer. It's much better than the original and the third game, which I actually don't like. And the reason is because it has a great story about Diddy becoming a man. So it's a coming-of-age story, kind of like Star Wars. And it also combines that with great gameplay, some of the best graphics, brilliant level design. Really, just a classic. It's hard to really explain it to anyone who's uninitiated. So without any further ado, here is Donkey Kong Country 2. As a kid, I gave a great deal of attention to Mario is Missing on the NES. Little did I know that there was actually a much better version on the Super Nintendo. And that game, of course, is Mario is Missing, the most criminally underrated game in the entire Nintendo library. That includes all Nintendo consoles. Now, this game was really innovative. It took Mario in a different direction. It was very educational. And it also put Luigi in the spotlight. So this was a game which potentially had, could have provided for many sequels, but Nintendo decided to go in a different direction. Now, normally I think that Nintendo is generally on the right side of every decision. However, in this case, I think they screwed up pretty badly. Anyway, enough of that. Without any further ado, here is Mario is Missing, the 4th greatest game on the Super Nintendo. Earlier, I happened to mention that I was a really big fan of the Mortal Kombat style of graphics employed in Batman Forever. However, Batman Forever really just set the stage for Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero, where the original masters of pre-rendered graphics came back and created a 2.5D side-scrolling beat-em-up starring Sub-Zero. This game is pretty amazing graphically and technically, and that's a lot of why it's the 3rd greatest game on the system. Now, it also has great gameplay. It's a brilliant platformer, and it really just checks a lot of boxes for me. And this game really does show that the Mode 7 graphics on SNES were so good that they could have literally just kept using this console and delayed the release of the Nintendo 64 for a couple more years, because this was already as good or better than anything that you would have found on the PlayStation at the time. So without any further ado, here is the number 3 game of all time on SNES, Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero.
You will fail. Finish him. Spare me.
On the NES, it was a well-known fact that the only people who didn't like Castlevania were steers and queers. Steers, of course, don't play video games, so you know who all the people were who didn't like it. Super Castlevania 4, though, this game continues the legacy, and it's almost as good as the NES originals. This is one of the best examples of Mode 7 graphics. There are plenty of examples throughout the game, and the gameplay is very smooth, the sound is excellent. Everything in this game really does show off the full power of the SNES. So, without any further ado, here is Super Castlevania 4, the second greatest SNES game of all time. Although we've already mentioned Mario once, it's a Nintendo platform, so we need to mention Mario twice. The greatest game of all time on the Super Nintendo was without a doubt Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. This includes all three of the epic Mario games on the NES, with then Super Mario World, the first game on the Super Nintendo. This is one hell of a value. A lot of the Sega SJW types will talk about how Genesis was a lot cheaper than SNES, but what they won't tell you deliberately is that the greatest value of this generation was on Super Nintendo in the form of Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. The gameplay is phenomenal, and it also enabled a new generation of players if they didn't have an NES for whatever reason, if they lived under a rock or whatever the case might be, to then play the original Mario games and then the Super Nintendo version, which was basically Mario 4. So without a doubt, and without any further ado, the number one game on SNES of all time, Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. I'm sure that there will be those of you out there who disagree with my opinions, but you probably haven't played your SNES in years, so you have no idea what holds up and what doesn't, and you probably haven't done the kind of research that I have on this topic. And I imagine that a lot of you who will sit down and write these really long comments about how my opinions are wrong, are probably the same kind of dopes who went out and bought the Sega Dreamcast. So, anyway, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with truth-flavored bias, signing out.